Minister. Thank you, Mr. Bone, and good to have you looking after the second half of our proceedings today. And can I just start by echoing the repeated compliments and tributes to my honourable friend from Southport, who has led this debate and kicked off a tremendously important, and I think by turns angry, passionate, emotional set of contributions from a series of colleagues, many of whom have served personally in Her Majesty's Armed Forces, and even those who haven't done so, including, indeed, people who've confessed to being lawyers during the course of the afternoon. Everyone has been incredibly, I think, understanding and sympathetic to the plight which we are all discussing here today. My honourable friend from Southport started rightly, I think, by saying that the vast majority of the deaths caused during the Troubles were caused by terrorists. A very small minority can be attributed to the actions of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. And I should just pause and say, it isn't just, if you listen to veterans, it isn't just a question of prosecutions. Those are difficult enough and they need a lot of support. It is also a question of the repeated and unending investigations before any prosecution ever happens. And in fact, in many cases, no prosecution has ever happened in most cases, but people are living in fear of the knock at the door, the cavalcade of police cars turning up at 5 a.m, the repeated interviews, often, as my honourable friend from Wells eloquently put it, of events that happened not just 30, 40, 50 years ago, but happened in the fog of war and were hard to remember and define and record clearly a few days later, let alone decades further on. So then we had, Mr. Bone, a catalogue of worries, of concerns, of justified, I think, outrage. Comments like betrayal, injustice, and lawfare. In fact, I thought one of the most telling contributions was made by my honourable friend from Newbury, who intervened early on and made the point, which I think was widely accepted, and he's a former Green Jacket himself, that soldiers went out to protect innocent civilians, whereas terrorists went out specifically to kill and maim. And his point was that there should be no moral equivalence between those two purposes. This is a point which has been made many, many times by other people during the course of this afternoon's discussions. We've then ended up, Mr. Bone, with, I think, one of the most powerful speeches I've heard in a long time from the Honourable and Gallant Member for Beckenham. Equipped with his yellow card, which he'd kept all that time from his tours in Northern Ireland, and he made the point about decisions made in milliseconds which then get re-examined at leisure in peaceful courtrooms many years later. That is extremely hard to justify as an approach to justice. And he also made, I think eloquently, a point which others made as well. He said, we acted within the law, but if we didn't, we should be prosecuted. And that is a point which has been made repeatedly by other people here as well. In fact, it was made by the honourable gentleman from Southport when he kicked this thing off. He said that the rule of law must be applied, but for service people, breaches of those laws were a very rare exception. They were not the norm. But nobody here is trying to pretend, I don't think I've heard a single person say, that those breaches of the law shouldn't be treated with utmost care and gravity and severity. But nor should we pretend that they were common or ubiquitous or frequent either. And it is essential when we try to maintain a sense of proportion, a sense of balance here, which many people have rightly, I think, pointed out, is widely felt not to have been achieved, that we don't forget that central fact. The honourable gentleman from East Belfast made the absolutely correct point. Sacrifice doesn't come in different grades, he said. And he said also that any solution must work under Article 2 of the Human Rights Act, and he's absolutely right about that. He also made a crucial distinction between an amnesty and a statute of limitations, a point which was echoed later on. And he rightly said that we need to do more before, one of the more affecting points, I thought, read out a very sombre and sober lists of names of some of the people killed just in the few weeks before the Bloody Sunday outrages. The Select Committee Chair, my honourable friend from New Forest East, was, I thought, extremely careful in his views because he said, look, we need to make progress. In fact, we are making some progress, but he rightly said, but we have not made enough progress, not nearly enough progress. And he then mentioned the Nelson Mandela approach. And if I Will, I wish to come back to that point because I think that that is central to any potential action and solution that we may want to come to later. And I will try and make sure, Mr. Bone, that not only do I leave a few moments for my honourable friend from Southport to respond, but also to suggest at the end of this some actions that can be taken. Because rightly, people have said repeatedly that words are all very well. Politicians, all of us here, are good at words. I'm afraid this is a Westminster Hall debate which doesn't result in legislation per se. So we can't debate a law here this afternoon, but we can at least start to move towards actions, and I hope to be able to propose some of those happily, but briefly if I can.
Could my honourable friend brief us and tell us why the Prime Minister excluded Northern Ireland veterans from the 10-year exclusion policy that, as I believe, it is hopefully going to go forward?
Mr. Byrne, this is something which was discussed at some length in the urgent question last Thursday as well. And there's an important point which a number of people have made during the course of this afternoon's debate and also was made on Thursday, which is that for people serving on Operation Banner, it didn't feel any different. It felt the same, whether if you were patrolling in Northern Ireland or if you were patrolling in Basra or in Afghanistan, doesn't matter where. The surroundings may have been different, but it felt the same and you felt under the same pressures and you expected, and I think morally everyone here has made the point rightly, that we owe, as a society, the same debt of gratitude, and not just a debt of gratitude, but also, as I think my honourable friend from Wells rightly pointed out, I think he said, and I'm probably going to misquote him here, that no matter what happens, come what may, we've got your back. And so no matter where you've served, that should be the outcome. The difficulty, to answer his point, is that in strict legal terms, the legal basis under which the service took place, abroad or in the UK, is different. Our challenge as lawmakers is to make sure that the outcome for our servicemen and women is the same. They may have to start from different places, but the destination has to be the same. And if we cannot do that, Mr. Bone, then we will have failed and failed really badly. My honourable friend, very briefly, I'm just conscious of making sure I've got enough time to...
Very grateful to the Minister because he conceptualised well the challenge. Is he up for it?
Mr. Bone, I certainly am, and I hope to come on to at least some initial comments about the actions that we might be able to take as a Parliament and as a government going forward, and as a society going forward. I will very briefly, and then I must make progress, otherwise...
Simply to say, I'm sure we're all concerned to get to root causes, and so I just very much hope he'll get to the Stormont House Agreement.
That is indeed one of the points I'm going to make when we come to the actions as well. Can I just briefly mention, though, the Honourable Gentleman from Strangford, who made one of the most emotional contributions. He served, I think, in Northern Ireland himself, and his enjoinder that we must all be honourable and do right by our veterans, and he is absolutely right. And then I thought one of the most thoughtful examples of controlled anger of the afternoon, which came from my honourable friend and gallant friend from Plymouth Moor View, who said, we have to do more. I think everybody here would agree with that. He also said, we're not asking, he said, for an amnesty for war crimes. He said a statute of limitations, pure and simple, can't work because there should never be a time limit on serious criminal behaviour, although he was then interested and saying something around the announced presumption of non-prosecutions looks promising, he was pointing out. But he also, and I think this is a point which everybody here would echo as well, he was also rightly contemptuous of the false narrative of hope which the legal teams of the lawfare profession are using to manipulate victims' grief. And then finally, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, I won't go through everybody, but I just wanted to say, my right honourable friend, member for Chingford and Woodford, said quite rightly, and this is the point I was just making, that UK law can't be used, the fact that it's UK law rather than service abroad, cannot be used as an excuse for failing to help Northern Ireland service versus service abroad. This cannot stand, and it is a deep injustice. I will gloss over, just because of pressure of time, Mr. Bone, some of the other comments, but they were all valid. My honourable friend from Dorset South, himself a former Grenadier Guard, made the point that our words must match our action. He's absolutely right. My honourable friend from Wells, a former rifleman, said, how can legal cases be tried justly decades later after the fog of war has passed? And my right honourable friend, the member for Shropshire North, a former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland himself, so a man who has personal experience of many of these policy issues as well, said, and I think again this is a point which would be widely echoed right the way around this chamber, that no further legal process should happen unless there is clear and categoric new evidence. A point I think made as well by my honourable friend from Witney, who said that we need to not go anywhere near what used to be called the double jeopardy rule, where you can't be tried twice for the same effect. So, Mr. Chairman, what must we achieve? Well, we must achieve an answer which will do several things. It must work for veterans in the armed forces. Yes, of course it must. But it must also work for former police officers and prison guards and wardens too. They are not armed forces. They have a different legal basis, but it must work for them as well. It must work for innocent, peaceful Catholics and Protestants alike in Northern Ireland as well. People who have never served, never wanted to serve, but were potentially in the line of fire from some of the actions that took place. It must work for the victims and the families of the victims, and we've heard some of that, but it needs to be emphasised, and it must also, most importantly, it must work in court so that when inevitably the legal challenges come from the lawfare brigade, this thing stands up and is robust, because if it does not, then we will, Mr. Bone, have failed in our duty to protect our former service men and women. It is no point coming up with something which sounds great and then falls over the first time a clever lawyer pokes it in court. That will not stand. And finally, Mr. Bone, and I've treble underlined this in my notes, it must draw a line. It must draw a line and allow people to move on. Not just the victims, not just the veterans. It must allow the whole society in Northern Ireland to draw a line. And that is why I come back to the point made by the chairman of the Select Committee. It is not an exact comparison between Northern Ireland, which is a unique place, and South Africa, but there are many parallels, saying we have to find some way of creating an approach which will allow people to get closure and truth and justice. And therefore, what I hope we will do, and what I expect us to do, is firstly, soon, very soon, Mr. Bone, publish the results of the consultation so we can all see what people in Northern Ireland genuinely think about the details of the questions, and then, again, promptly after that, announce the government response, which needs to be actions, not words. The Stormont proposals are a starting point, but there are genuine concerns on all sides about the details of those proposals. They cannot stand as they are, but they are a good starting point, and we need to work on the details about how we modify those so that we can then bring forward a bill. And the crucial thing, Mr. Bone, is the point made in the end by my right honourable friend for Chingford and Woodford. When natural justice collides with the law must change, and that is what we do here.
Damien Moore, to wind up.
Thank you, Mr. Bone. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship for the conclusion of this debate today. I would like to thank all honourable, right honourable and gallant friends and members for their contributions, particularly the gallant member for Beckenham and the honourable member for Strangford. We have a moral obligation to ensure that justice is done. It doesn't mean special treatment for veterans, but what it does mean is that if we are to have, for example, a statute of limitations, that they are not excluded from it, because they do deserve fairness, justice and closure on this issue.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 243947 relating to immunity for soldiers. As many as that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.